They called me Whisper, not because I was timid, but because my voice never needed volume to strike. I speak 7 languages. I've de-escalated hostage crises without firing a shot. But none of that mattered the day my own father, a 4-star general, stood up at the Pentagon and declared me useless in front of 1,000 officers. That was the moment I realized my family didn't just ignore me, they were prepared to erase me. But even whispers can echo through walls of power, and now I'm going to make sure they hear every single word. The Pentagon auditorium was colder than I remembered, not in temperature, but in presence. A sea of blue and gold uniforms surrounded me, each shoulder heavy with ribbons, each back held impossibly straight by decades of legacy and protocol. I sat in the 10th row, back stiff, breath shallow, as the room buzzed with subtle anticipation. Today was supposed to honour my father, General Arthur Mendez, for a lifetime of service. A legend in polished leather boots. A man whose shadow stretched farther than most legacies ever dared. And yet, despite the ornate banners, the spotless brass, and the parade of salutes, I had never felt smaller. My name was Julia Mendez, 35, captain in the military police corps, fluent in 7 languages, and completely invisible to the 2 men standing tall in the VIP section. My father, stoic, unflinching. My brother, Daniel, gleaming in his West Point perfection, the golden boy who wore expectation like armour. They stood together, a picture of military glory. I was just the unwanted caption. They hadn't even acknowledged me when I entered. Not a nod, not a glance, not even a flicker of recognition as I stood a few paces away in full dress uniform, the same uniform, by the way, they had bled to preserve. But for them, my fabric meant nothing. It wasn't earned, it was tolerated. The ceremony began with usual fanfare, anthems, introductions, a brief reminder of why we were all gathered. Commendations were read, medals bestowed. I stared at the polished shoes of the officer in front of me, anything to keep my mind grounded. Then the master of ceremonies, a colonel with a voice built for parade grounds, stepped forward. We now honour an officer whose behind-the-scenes contributions have saved countless American lives, through words, not weapons. A woman whose linguistic prowess has changed the trajectory of missions in ways that can't be measured in medals. My breath caught. Captain Julia Mendez, Military Police Corps. It was like time paused, eyes turned. A few surprised murmurs rippled through the seats. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I had trained for moments of chaos, but nothing prepared me for this exposure. But before anyone could applaud, another voice thundered from the VIP aisle. "That's enough!" Gasps echoed as every head turned toward the booming interruption. General Arthur Mendez had stepped into the centre aisle, his voice cutting through the air like shrapnel. The colonel stammered, clearly caught off guard. "My daughter," he began, voice rising, "is not a hero. She's a translator, a bookworm. This is the army, not a library." A stunned silence fell over the room. I felt my cheeks burn, my spine lock. The floor beneath me may as well have turned to glass. I could see my brother still beside him, hands folded, expression calm, as if this public execution were a routine debriefing. "I taught men to lead battalions," my father continued, jabbing a finger in the air. "She reads poetry to terrorists." No one spoke. No one intervened. Even the colonel had frozen. My fellow officers avoided my gaze. I was no longer an attendee, I was a spectacle. Tears threatened, but I held them back. I had cried for my father before. I wouldn't give him that again. For a moment, I dared to look at Daniel. I hoped, just for a flicker, that he'd object, step forward, say anything. He didn't. He stood like marble, perfectly still, a silent ally to a war against his own sister. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just overlooked, I was expendable. And yet, I didn't leave. I didn't run. I stayed seated, back straight, hands folded in my lap. Because if they were going to try and bury me, then I would at least be the one to dig myself out. The silence that followed my father's words in the Pentagon was deafening. But the ache that bloomed in my chest wasn't born that day. It had roots that stretched far deeper, all the way back to a cramped kitchen in Fort Benning 17 years ago on Thanksgiving Day. I was 17 then, and I had something to share that I thought, naively, might finally shift the gravity of our home. Dinner was like every Mendez family holiday, formal, stiff, reverent to the military clock. My brother Daniel, home for a break from his first semester at West Point, was already the crown jewel. He wore his cadet uniform like it was tailored from glory itself, smiling modestly as relatives asked about leadership drills, combat prep, chain of command. And I sat quietly at the edge of the table, clutching an envelope in my lap. It was thick, cream-coloured, with the crest of Georgetown University embossed in deep navy, a full scholarship to their linguistics program. A dream, my dream. I had memorised every word of the acceptance letter, and yet it still felt unreal. I wanted to tell them so badly, to show them that I too had earned something worthy. But I waited. I watched the ebb and flow of conversation, the way everyone leaned in when my father spoke, the chuckles at Daniel's stories. I waited until dessert plates were being cleared, until the moment felt quiet enough for me to be heard. "Dad," I said softly, voice shaking, "I have something." I slid the envelope across the polished wood table toward him. He picked it up, barely glancing at the crest. His brows didn't lift. He didn't smile. "What is this?" he asked. "Georgetown," I said, trying to contain the trembling in my voice. "I got in, full scholarship, linguistics program." He set the envelope down, next to the turkey carcass, where bones and gravy-stained napkins had been tossed. He didn't even open it. "A linguistics scholarship," he said, not to me, but to the room. His voice wasn't angry, it was worse. It was cold. "Books again," he muttered, then gestured with his fork. "Look at your brother. That's purpose, that's strength. What are you going to do with a degree in language? Translate menus in Paris while men like him protect this country?" The table went quiet. I felt every eye slide away from me. Even my aunts and uncles, who'd smiled at me earlier, suddenly found interest in their forks. Daniel shrugged. It was a small gesture, but I saw it. The satisfied flicker in his eyes, the unspoken message, "You tried, you failed." I wanted to disappear, to crawl under the table, to run. But I stayed seated, hands clenched under the tablecloth. My heart thudded like a metronome, out of sync with the world. Then, as my father raised his wineglass and proclaimed, "A toast to Cadet Daniel Mendez, the pride of our family," I knew it. I was just a placeholder. An empty seat to balance the symmetry of the family portrait. They all toasted. Glasses clinked. Smiles returned. No one mentioned my name. And then I saw her, my mother. She had passed away 3 years before, but I saw her, clearly, on the edge of memory. A flash, a ghost in my mind. I remembered the last Thanksgiving she had been with us. The way her hand had rested lightly on mine as I spoke. The way her eyes lit up when I translated a poem for her in French. She used to tell me, "Language is a bridge, Julia. Build it, even when they don't want to cross." And in that moment, in the blur of shame and silence, I remembered the way she looked at me, full of pride, quiet but fierce. The only person who had ever made me feel seen. Back in the Pentagon, as the memory faded, I sat straighter. My father had buried me in words, but my mother's voice still lived in mine. And I was done being silent. Alaska wasn't just cold, it was punishing. The wind carved through layers like razors, and the snow didn't fall softly. It attacked. Fort Glace, my new post, sat perched like a forgotten outpost on the edge of the world. Assigned to the 14th Military Police Battalion, I was the only officer with a linguistics background. And as I soon learned, that didn't mean I was unique. It meant I was expendable. They called me Dictionary within hours of arrival, not in admiration but as a joke. "Hey, Dictionary, what does this mean in geek?" someone had laughed during my first briefing, waving a report covered in Pashto phrases. I gave the translation. He smirked and tossed the page aside. I became invisible again, but this time with a label. Days blurred into icy routines, patrols, debriefs, more cold. My requests to be included in strategy meetings were ignored. My expertise filed under soft skills, buried beneath the preference for fists and flashbangs. I spent my evenings in a storage room I converted into an unofficial workspace, tucked between shelves of outdated intel reports and dusty filing cabinets. There, I built something no one asked for. Using scraps of old case files, interrogation transcripts, and linguistic nuance, I created a system, part language matrix, part behavioral analysis model. It wasn't just about translating words, it was about patterns, cadence, stress markers, the way liars inhaled before verbs. I called it SEER, Strategic Empathy and Elicitation Response. No one cared until they had no choice. One freezing night, chaos erupted. A sting operation on a suspected smuggling ring went sideways. Our team had intercepted a convoy, black market weapons, en route to Anchorage. One suspect, a local with tribal markings, was detained. The problem? He spoke a remote dialect of Yupik mixed with rare Russian loanwords. No one could understand him, not even the AI translation modules. The interrogation room buzzed with frustration. Commanders barked orders. Intel officers threw guesses. The man sat silently, eyes darting, lips barely moving. I asked to try. "No offence, dictionary," Captain Harrow grunted, "but this isn't a crossword puzzle. We need answers." Still, I walked in. I sat across from the suspect, said nothing at first. I let silence settle like snow. Then I spoke. Not just in his dialect, but with the regional inflections I had studied. I asked about his village, his mother's cooking, a winter folk tale about snow wolves. His eyes widened. He blinked twice. Then he began to talk, not just about the weapons, but about the routes, the payoffs, the buyers. He sketched diagrams, named names. Within an hour, we had shut down an entire supply chain that had eluded intelligence for months. When I stepped out of the room, the hallway was silent. They stared. Captain Harrow didn't speak. Neither did the others. No applause, no praise, just stunned silence. I nodded and returned to my storage room lab, alone, because even when you saved them, they still didn't know where to place you. Weeks after the smuggling bust, I was summoned to Fort Meade. Not praised, summoned. The memo read like a formality. Captain Julia Mendez to present findings and process to Joint Intelligence Working Group. I could tell from the wording it wasn't curiosity that brought me there. It was obligation. The room looked like the future had swallowed a war bunker. Touchscreens lined the walls, real-time data streams pulsed overhead, and the air buzzed with the low hum of cooled servers. Tech officers, intelligence strategists, cyber warfare specialists, they all sat in rows, glossy-eyed and unimpressed. I stood at the front of the room, flanked by a projector, a whiteboard, and a single pitcher of water no one touched. I walked them through my process. How tonal inflection indicated truth-telling in rare dialects. How idiomatic phrasing, when paired with socio-political stressors, could predict compliance. I spoke of SEER, my system, and how behavioural micropatterns linked to linguistic constructs could crack suspects faster than intimidation. At minute 20, a man coughed loudly. At minute 25, someone yawned. And at minute 30, a colonel finally raised a hand, not to ask a question, but to say, "Isn't this what Google does?" The room chuckled. My throat tightened, but I didn't flinch. I ended the presentation, clicked off the projector, and thanked them for their time. No one clapped. They began standing, collecting tablets, adjusting ties. Just like that, it was over. Except for one man. He remained seated, a few rows back, arms crossed, lean build, calm eyes, regulation haircut. He hadn't smiled, hadn't laughed, hadn't looked away. He approached after the others filed out. No rush, no phone in hand. He stopped 2 feet away, nodded once. "Captain Mendez," he said, voice steady. "Nathan Cross, Cyber Division, Deep Signal. I have a question." I braced myself. "You mentioned reversal structures in spoken response, syntax inversion as a deception cue." "Yes," I replied, surprised. "In high-pressure interrogations, subjects often flip subject-object order when lying." "That's not in any manual," he said, tilting his head slightly. "That's not algorithmic, that's pattern art." He paused, then smiled faintly. "That's code." For a long moment we just stood there. "Most people heard your data," he continued, "but they didn't hear your method. They don't know how to listen when it's not in binary." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "So, you understood it?" "Completely," he said. Then he added, softer, "You don't speak loud, Captain, but I hear you." It wasn't a compliment. It was a connection. 2 minds, 2 codes, one in language, one in data, finally recognizing each other across the static. And in that moment, the cold of Fort Glace, the silence of that hallway, the nickname dictionary, they all felt a little lighter, because someone, finally, was listening. Kosovo was grey in every direction. Grey skies, grey buildings, grey moods. I was stationed near Pristina, tasked with facilitating sensitive negotiations between 2 rival factions, tribal leaders with long bloodlines and longer grudges. Language barriers, cultural slights, decades of distrust. It was a war that needed translators more than soldiers. That morning, the talks were particularly tense. A single mistranslated word could shatter weeks of progress. I was in the safe house's back room, monitoring audio feeds and preparing cultural briefs for the field negotiators. Then my satellite phone buzzed. I almost didn't answer. The number was encrypted but familiar. A military-grade line routed through DC. I pressed accept and brought it to my ear. "Julia," my father's voice filled the room. Cold, commanding. The same tone he used when disciplining subordinates not speaking to daughters. I froze. We hadn't spoken since the Pentagon incident, not even a line of formal correspondence. "Yes, sir," I said, because old habits don't die easily. There was a pause, then another voice cut in, slick, polished. "Hey, little sis." Daniel. That voice used to make me flinch. Now it made my jaw clench. "We've been following your work out there," he continued. "Heard the mission's sensitive, high stakes." "We're proud," my father added, but his voice held no warmth, just calculation. And that's when the temperature shifted. "There's something we need to discuss," he continued. "Atheon Corporation. They're supplying comms and logistical gear to your operation, correct?" I blinked. "Yes," I said slowly. "Some infrastructure. Why?" "There's an oversight review incoming," Daniel said casually, like he was talking about weather. "Some technical inconsistencies showing up on paper." "And?" I asked. "And we need that report to reflect well on Atheon," my father said. Silence. "We have a strong relationship with their executive team," he went on. "They've been loyal allies. A few tweaks to your summary, emphasize stability, downplay failures, it'll protect that partnership." I felt the ground shift beneath me. My father wasn't asking me to analyze. He was asking me to lie. "No," I said simply. "Excuse me?" he replied. "No," I repeated. "I won't falsify a report." "This isn't falsifying," Daniel chimed in. "It's strategic clarity." "It's dishonesty," I said, "and it's a violation of the UCMJ." There was silence. Then my father's voice dropped an octave, steel wrapped in venom. "Don't forget who gave you that uniform." The old Julia would have crumbled at that, but not anymore. "I earned this uniform," I said, "and I'll honor it, even if you never did." I ended the call without another word. My hand trembled slightly as I set the phone down. Outside, the clouds pressed lower. Inside, something settled. For the first time in my life, I had chosen principle over blood, and it would not be the last time I paid the price. 3 days later, I blared into the gravel of a nameless village in southern Kosovo. The operation had seemed routine, a final reconciliation meeting between the two faction leaders. A safe house, neutral ground, coordinated down to the minute. My team swept the area, the building was secure, the comms, provided by Atheon Corps, buzzed to life as scheduled, crackling with a bit more static than usual, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until the voice. It cut through my earpiece like ice, calm, deliberate, wrong. Malaka, it said. Little whisperer. My spine locked. No one outside my intel circle knew that code name. Whisper was my handle in deep operations, used only on secure black channel communications. No one, except my chain of command and my family. The voice continued, this time in Serbian, laced with eerie amusement. Is your father disappointed in you? I didn't get the chance to respond. The world exploded. Windows shattered inward as the walls rocked. Automatic gunfire raked the air. Screams, smoke, wood splintered. Someone shouted, "Ambush!" I pulled the two faction leaders down beneath a table, shielding them as bullets shredded the furniture. My team scrambled, firing back, radioing for backup, but it was a kill box. Someone had fed the enemy our location, our time, our fallback plans. Someone had handed us over. I reached for my sidearm, firing blindly toward the windows. A sharp sting bloomed across my left shoulder, a bullet tearing through muscle and uniform. Hot blood slicked my arm, soaking into the Kevlar. Through the haze, I saw Ramirez fall, one of my youngest soldiers, barely 23, a gut wound, too much blood. He looked at me, eyes wide, frightened, not of dying, but of being forgotten. I crawled to him, applying pressure, whispering reassurance, even as the roar of gunfire drowned my voice. My hand slipped in his blood. He reached up, grasped my wrist. "Captain," he whispered. "They knew." Then he was gone. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours, but lasted less than 10 minutes. When the helicopters finally arrived, thunderous, late, bright with floodlights, the attackers melted into the surrounding hills. The ground was littered with brass casings, shattered wood, and pieces of the life we barely held on to. I sat slumped against the back wall of the house, blood drying on my neck, my shoulder screaming with pain. Medics rushed around me. I couldn't hear them. All I could hear was that voice, whispering my name like a curse only family could know. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't an insurgent guess. It was surgical. Only one conclusion remained. I had been betrayed. Not by enemies, by blood. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared ahead, eyes dry, jaw clenched. And somewhere behind that pain, that fire, that grief, I felt it. The last shred of fear inside me burned to ash. When I stood again that night, I was no longer a soldier trying to be accepted. I was a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. The transfer to Fort Belvoir was swift and wrapped in formalities. For your safety, they said, until the investigation concludes. But I knew better. I wasn't being protected. I was being silenced. Buried in admin work, hidden under layers of bureaucracy, surrounded by people who smiled too politely and asked no questions. I requested a secure workspace, just a laptop, a desk, and high-level access. They granted it, perhaps thinking I'd quietly fade behind the fog of paperwork. They had no idea what silence meant to someone like me. The day I arrived, I sent one message, encrypted, routed through back channels only 2 people in the world still remembered how to use. It read, "Need your eyes, something doesn't fit. J.M." Nathan responded within the hour. "Tell me where to dig." We worked in code. I didn't mention the ambush, not yet. I didn't tell him about Ramirez. I didn't say how the gunfire still echoed in my ears. I focused on what mattered most, Atheon Corp. The after-action reports on their communications hardware were too perfect. Their systems, supposedly, ran at 99.8% efficacy under stress. No significant interference, no critical faults, no unexplained outages. It read like a sales pitch, not a military log. But the language, God, the language was off. Words repeated unnaturally, passive structures where active voice was standard, terms like minor redundancies encountered during user interface synchronization instead of signal drop. No one who's actually worked a battlefield writes like that. So I dug. I compiled 12 reports from 3 different bases. I laid them side by side, line for line. And there it was, a hidden rhythm, a linguistic fingerprint. Errors that weren't errors. The same incorrect syntax appeared across different authors, bases, time zones, as if someone had templated the language, swapped out just enough to make each report look unique. They're cloning data, I messaged Nathan. Someone's rubber-stamping failures. He dove into the digital side, scraping metadata from archived network logs, piecing together server calls. I waited in the cold hum of my grey office, staring at the empty door like a sniper waits for movement. 16 hours later, Nathan sent one line, "Found your ghost." Attached was a list of IP access logs. Buried among routine data dumps, masked under an administrator account, sat 3 distinct pings, all originating from the same device. The terminal ID? Dan MNDZ01 Daniel Mendez. I stared at the screen, pulse thudding in my ears. He hadn't just covered for Atheon, he'd forged the damn reports, and now I had proof. The man who once toasted his own name over pumpkin pie had signed off on the blood of my team. Nathan didn't stop with the IP address. He kept digging, deeper than military protocol allowed, threading through encrypted voice logs, archived in Atheon's internal cloud servers, files marked as corrupted or non-indexed. Titch. The kind of files you bury not because they're broken, but because they're dangerous. At 3:17 a.m, my screen lit up with a single message. "Julia, you need to hear this." Attached was a recovered audio file, no subject line, no explanation. I plugged in my headphones, hit play. It was Daniel's voice, clear, sharp, rehearsed. "She's getting too close," he said. "We can't risk another leak. Make it look like a local dispute, civilian escalation, just enough chaos to bury it." Another man, lower voice, probably the Atheon CEO, replied with hesitation. "That could get messy." Daniel's response was like a knife. "Then make it clean. I don't care how. Just silence her. Permanently." The file ended. I sat there, frozen. My hand gripped the desk hard enough to ache. The chill wasn't from the air, it came from inside. He hadn't just betrayed me, he had ordered my death. I was still shaking when the next file came in. Nathan had traced the approval trail for the comm systems at our Kosovo base. A digital contract, post-dated to 24 hours after the ambush. At the bottom was an electronic signature, General Arthur Mendez. I zoomed in on the metadata, time-stamped, verified. There was no mistaking it. My father had authorized the continuation of Atheon's services after my team was nearly wiped out, after his son had tried to erase me. I expected rage. I expected grief. What I didn't expect was clarity, like smoke clearing from a burning room. He had never protected me, never believed in me. But now I knew the truth in full color. He didn't just cast me out of the family, he wanted me gone. For good. And I had evidence. I opened a new message window, drafted a secure file bundle, audio file, metadata, report analysis, SEER overlays, IP logs, everything. I didn't trust military channels. I didn't trust my own command. But there was one man whose integrity had never bent, General Gregory Hawke. Decorated, respected, a man of steel principles and no patience for corruption. I typed only one line into the email body, "Sir, the Army's honour is at risk. This is the truth." Then I hit send. And for the first time since the ambush, I exhaled. Not because I was safe, but because the silence had ended. The invitation came in a thick, embossed envelope, sealed with the Department of Defense insignia. "You are cordially invited to attend the Lifetime Achievement Ceremony honouring General Arthur Mendez." Cordially, as if none of it had happened. I almost laughed, but I didn't decline. I pressed my uniform, polished my shoes, and made sure every ribbon sat exactly where it belonged, not because I sought approval, but because I wanted to be undeniable. The auditorium at the Pentagon looked the same as before, rows of brass, dark suits, polished marble, but this time I wasn't in the 10th row. I was seated in the front, directly across from the podium, directly across from him. My father stood in the wings of the stage, shaking hands with admirals, trading the kind of smiles that held no weight with me anymore. Daniel stood just behind him, spine straight, face blank. I didn't look away, and I didn't smile. The lights dimmed. A brass quartet played the national anthem. Then the MC took the stage, listing General Mendez's achievements, 40 years of service, battlefield innovations, legacy leadership. The applause was thunderous, until General Hawke stepped to the podium. He didn't read from notes. He didn't glance at the teleprompter. He simply placed both hands on the lectern and looked out at the room. "Before we conclude today's ceremony," he began, voice crisp, "I must address an issue of grave concern, one that touches not just this room, but the very foundation of our institution." Murmurs rippled, backs straightened. A security breach during a peacekeeping operation in Kosovo resulted in multiple injuries and the loss of American life. The incident was initially reported as a systems malfunction. He gestured to the screen behind him. But we have since uncovered evidence of deliberate interference. The screen blinked to life. A network diagram appeared, lines, nodes, terminal IDs. At first, it was technical noise to most in the room. But I saw it. There, center frame, was Dan MNDZ01. Hawke continued. An unauthorized access port was opened just hours before the ambush. The signature was traced to a terminal registered under Major Daniel Mendez. The room fell into stunned silence, and then he said it. "We believe this action contributed directly to the compromise of the mission." He turned slightly, "But don't take my word for it." Another gesture, another screen. Audio filled the hall, Daniel's voice, clear as crystal. "She's getting too close. Just silence her. Permanently." You could hear a pin drop, eyes snap to Daniel, then to Arthur, then back to me. I sat still. I didn't gloat, I didn't cry. I simply stared at the man who had once told me I was a waste of a uniform. And for the first time in his life, he blinked. No one moved. Not the generals, not the aides, not the photographers with their long lenses poised to capture a tribute, only now capturing a downfall. Daniel didn't speak. He couldn't. His mouth was slightly open, as if grasping for a denial that refused to arrive. The colour drained from his face as two uniformed military police officers approached from opposite aisles, crisp and silent. They flanked him, gave him no time to protest. One reached for the cuffs, the other read him his rights. Daniel Mendez, the pride of the family, was led away without a sound. Still, the room didn't breathe. Then slowly, General Hawke turned to me. "Captain Julia Mendez," he said, his voice echoing with precision. "Please join me." My chair creaked slightly as I stood. Every eye in the room followed my steps. Each click of my shoes against the marble floor felt heavier than the last. I wasn't walking toward a podium. I was walking through 20 years of judgment, silence, and betrayal. When I reached the stage, I didn't look at the audience. I looked at my father. He hadn't moved, but his hands were clenched now, white-knuckled against the chair's arms. And his eyes, those eyes I had spent my childhood trying to impress, were wide with something I had never seen in him before. Fear. The kind that strips a man of all pretense. The kind that comes not from consequences, but from finally realizing you built your kingdom on sand. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. General Hawke gave me a simple nod. It was subtle. But in that gesture lived more respect than my father had ever shown me. I returned the nod, then turned and stepped down from the stage. As I passed my father's row, I paused, not to acknowledge him, but to make sure he saw the truth. I wasn't the little girl at the Thanksgiving table anymore. I was the reckoning. And as I reached the final step, something extraordinary happened. One by one, officers stood. Captains, majors, colonels, even generals in full regalia. No orders, no cue. They rose in silence. It wasn't a military salute. It was a human one. They weren't honouring General Arthur Mendez. They were honouring Whisper. The woman who'd fought without rage, exposed truth without vengeance, and stood unshaken in the ruins of a family that tried to erase her. I kept walking, straight-backed, unapologetic, because I knew something now, something more powerful than rank, more lasting than legacy. Dignity whispered could still silence giants. The marble floors of the Pentagon were quieter now. The echoes of ceremony had faded, leaving behind the faint hum of air vents and the occasional shuffle of passing boots. I walked toward the main corridor, still in uniform, still numb. That's when I saw him, Daniel, flanked by 2 MPs, wrists bound in stainless steel cuffs that caught the light like broken medals. He looked like a ghost in a perfectly pressed uniform. As I stepped into his path, the guards paused, unsure if they should let us speak. I gave them a small nod. They held back, just far enough for us to share a moment that neither of us wanted. "You think you won?" he hissed, voice low, acidic. "You destroyed everything. Our name, our legacy. You shattered this family." I didn't flinch. "No," I said quietly. "I just cleaned up the mess you and Dad left behind." His jaw clenched, but his eyes, those same smug eyes that once gleamed across dinner tables, were now panicked, fragile. "Why couldn't you just stay quiet?" he asked. "Why couldn't you just play your part?" "Because I was never cast in yours," I said. "I didn't betray this family, Daniel. You did. You just didn't expect anyone to notice when the house started burning." He sneered, a pale echo of the arrogance he used to wear like armour. As the MPs pulled him forward, I watched him walk away and felt nothing. No triumph, no vengeance. Just the clean severing of a chain I dragged for too long. Later that evening, while I was packing up a case of sealed evidence folders, a quiet knock tapped against my office door. It was my Aunt Cecilia. She didn't wear the uniform, never had. She was a schoolteacher from Ohio, the only member of my family who ever sent me birthday cards after Mom died. Her eyes were tired. "He wants to see you," she said simply. I didn't ask who. She handed me a folded note. No letterhead, no signature, just one line, scrawled in my father's tight, slanted handwriting. "Julia, coffee, just once." It wasn't an order. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. The cafe in Arlington was half empty, dim with afternoon shadow, and smelled faintly of burnt espresso and nostalgia. It was the kind of place where old generals met retired contractors and pretended their world hadn't shrunk. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, facing the window, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him. General Arthur Mendez, my father. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but in presence. His back wasn't ramrod straight. His jaw wasn't set like stone. He looked like a man who had once been carved from iron and had slowly rusted from the inside out. He didn't rise when I approached. He only looked up, eyes bloodshot, unreadable. "Julia," he said quietly. I nodded but didn't sit. He gestured to the chair across from him. I took it, slow and measured, setting my gloves on the table like a shield. For a long moment we said nothing, the clatter of plates, The hiss of steam from the barista's machine. 2 patrons laughed softly behind us, but at our table there was only silence. Finally, he slid a small black box across the table. I stared at it. "I wore this through 3 wars," he said. "Passed to me from your grandfather. He earned it at West Point in 42. I always thought—" He hesitated. "I always thought you'd wear it someday." I opened the box. A heavy gold ring rested inside. The West Point crest glinted under the cafe's yellow light. It was worn smooth in places, by time, by sweat, by expectation. I closed the box gently, pushed it back across the table. "No," I said, voice calm. He blinked. "It's yours." "No," I repeated. "It isn't. You see, honor doesn't live in gold or in stone buildings. It doesn't live in a name or a ring or a rank." I leaned in slightly. "It lives in our choices, in the ones we make when no one is watching. And you—" I paused. "You made yours." His eyes fell to the table, the weight of decades settling in his shoulders. "I didn't know what else to do," he said, barely above a whisper. "You could have done the right thing," I replied. Silence. He didn't argue, didn't try to justify, didn't beg, and that was almost enough, but not quite. I stood. He didn't. As I turned, I glanced once at the window. The reflection of the 2 of us, frozen in the glass, looked like strangers sharing a table out of obligation. And that's all we were now. Strangers bound by history but not by blood. I walked out into the cold Virginia air and didn't look back. Not because I hated him, but because I finally didn't need him anymore. Fort Leonard Wood was green, quiet, and far enough from DC to feel like another country. The hills rolled instead of towering. The air smelled of pine, not politics. And for the first time in years, I wasn't stationed in a war zone or a data bunker. I was assigned a classroom. It felt surreal. After the fallout, after the tribunals and the quiet disgrace of the Mendez name, General Hawke had offered me something unexpected, a position at the U.S. Army Military Police School. Not a demotion, not a punishment, a purpose. He'd said, "We don't need more door kickers. We need thinkers who can stop the door from ever being closed." So I accepted. The course was new, experimental, a blend of psychology, cultural intelligence, and advanced linguistic strategy. I called it Strategic Empathy in Conflict Zones. Some thought the name too soft. I knew better. Empathy wasn't weakness. It was a weapon, one that couldn't be seen coming. The day before the first class, I unlocked my assigned lecture hall. The brass nameplate on the door wasn't what I expected. Etched neatly into the surface were 2 simple words. The whisper room. My breath caught. Nathan. He hadn't signed it. Didn't need to. It was his fingerprint, left in silence. I stepped inside. The room was simple. Clean rows of desks, a whiteboard, a mounted projector. But on the back wall, framed in glass, hung a quote. "The quietest voices often speak the loudest truths." No attribution, just truth. That morning, 15 soldiers sat in my classroom, sharp-eyed, skeptical, mostly male, mostly younger. I stood at the front, hands clasped behind my back. "Tell me," I said, "what's more dangerous in a negotiation, a lie or a silence?" A few raised eyebrows. One corporal muttered, "Depends on who's armed." I smiled. "No, it depends on who's listening." We dove in. I taught them how to read pauses, how body language shifts under stress, how cultural misunderstandings can spark firefights. I showed them how the wrong greeting in rural Mali could end a mission, or how a correctly chosen proverb in Pashto could end one without bloodshed. They leaned in, they listened, and by the end the skepticism faded. After class, as the room cleared, one young specialist lingered. She was quiet, the kind who took notes even when no one asked. Captain Mendez, she said hesitantly. I turned. Yes? She swallowed, then said something that stopped me cold. I never knew empathy could be a tactic. I smiled, not at her, but with her. It's the oldest one we've got, I said. It just doesn't always make the movies. She nodded, then left. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope. It arrived in a plain manila envelope. No return address, no official markings. Just my name written in cursive I hadn't seen in years. Cecilia, my aunt. I waited until the classroom was empty before opening it. Inside was one photograph, faded, edges soft with age. I knew the moment I saw it. Me, age 10, sitting cross-legged on the hardwood floor of our old house at Fort Riley. Head down, completely engrossed in a thick French-English dictionary nearly as big as my torso. My hair was pulled back in a crooked ponytail. My mouth slightly open as if sounding out the words. The image hit like a heartbeat. I remembered that afternoon, how it was raining outside, how my mother had just brewed chamomile tea, how she'd whispered, "Your mind is a world, Julia. Never stop exploring it." That book had been hers. When she passed, it became my inheritance. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in small, tight letters, my aunt's handwriting again. "Your father asked me to send this. He didn't say much, only that this is how he wants to remember you." I stared at the note for a long time. There was no apology, no grand gesture, just a snapshot of who I used to be, before uniforms, before ranks, before betrayal, and somehow that was enough, not to forgive him, but to forgive myself. For years I had twisted myself into impossible shapes trying to earn his approval. I had bled under standards built for someone else's definition of worth. I had chased a ghost. But this little girl? This girl on the floor with her nose buried in words? She had always been enough. I pinned the photo beside the brass plaque that read "The Whisper Room," 2 legacies side by side, one inherited, one earned. I stepped back, hands on hips, and let the memory settle. Then I whispered aloud, just to the air, "I'm not the legacy he wanted." A pause, then a smile, "But I'm the legacy I built." Outside the window, Missouri wind rustled the trees, soft and persistent. And inside that quiet room, I finally felt free.